This means even if you have every good intention, if you break the law, you're still going to be exposed to these symbol files. And they can be extremely expensive and ruinous. Last but not least, we have these computer crimes. And these are relatively recent laws. These are less than 10 years old. And now we criminalize all of these different ways of getting into computer systems. And unlike what you read kind of or watch in television, where it's an outside hacker, many of these prosecutions under this law have been brought against employees of companies because they use their own computer access to take records or documents out. So think about how many times you download things to your hard drive on your laptop, or you put it on your iBook, or you put it on an iPad, or you put it on a thumb drive, to be able to work. And so if it turns out that you're doing it in a way that's inconsistent with the rights of the owner of that information, you can be prosecuted under these laws, even as an employee of the company. And increasingly, companies are going to the FBI, and they are prosecuting employees who take technology information out of a company through a computer network. And so these are the penalties now. And they have just really enhanced these quite a bit. In addition to giving the government the right to prosecute, Congress also added a right separately for the owner of the information to sue the individual, the hacker or the employee. So now you face government civil prosecution, government criminal prosecution, employer lawsuit, on top of a suit for breaching your non-disclosure agreement with your employee. So there's a lot of tools that people can use against you if you break up and break into computer systems or are alleged to have gone into a computer system. Okay, George.
Yeah, we have time. The next two things, we're going to talk about some cases, and then we're going to end up with some takeaways of what we think you should take away from today's experience and presentation. Are there any questions so far on Nelson's presentation on the complexity of various laws? Yeah.
There's recently announcing the PIS and ITAR is going to be consolidated. What's the progress on that?
Ed asked the question about whether there's a consolidation of the rules for dual use and for ITAR regulated products. I'm working in the middle of that process right now with the government, and here's the background. In the United States, we have three different agencies, primarily two agencies, the State Department for ITAR and the Commerce Department for EAR, or dual use things. If you go across the border in Canada, they have one set of rules in one agency. If you go to England, they have one set of rules, one agency. So our rules kind of grew up kind of by historical accident, and it has created a lot of administrative headache and a lot of compliance headache for companies all over the United States to have two separate rules, two separate agencies, and overlapping terms, overlapping definitions. They're not quite consistent. And so the Obama administration, under Secretary Gates at Defense, Secretary Clinton at State, and Secretary Gary Locke, who was at Commerce, made an agreement following an order from President Obama to try to work to consolidate these things. The term for all of this effort is called Export Control Reform, or ECR. Under ECR, the ITAR list, the backbone list of the ITAR, which is called the U.S. Munitions List, is being rewritten in the way that the U.S. Munitions List was written even a year ago. It had big categories, and it said it controlled rifles. It didn't say what size rifles, it didn't say what kind of caliber or rapidity or range or anything. It just said rifles. It said tanks. It said ships. And that was the whole of the rule. So many companies were floundering around trying to say, is this a controlled rifle or is this an uncontrolled rifle? And each time we wanted that decision, you had to ask the government, is my rifle in or out? So if you went over to the Commerce Department list, their list is written in very specific numerical parameters. 10 millimeters or less, 3 angstrom or less, 5 kilohertz or faster, and so on. And so it was much more quantitative. So the Obama administration adopted a policy that every category in the U.S. munitions list would be rewritten to specify the specific things they wanted to control. And for everything they did control, as much as possible, they would list numerical parameters. And that's what they've been doing, category by category. They're almost through the entire U.S. munitions list. There are 4 categories, I think, left that have not been revised. And all of those are beginning to go into effect now. For instance, the new rules on jet engines and aircraft are already in effect under this revision. And so it's really changed the way it's controlled. Still 2 agencies. When you consolidate agencies, that requires Congress to act. Congress has not wanted to act in this field for decades, and there's total paralysis on the Hill. So the Obama administration has done everything it can, short of new legislation, to bring some order and sanity. The long-term objective of ECR is to make the 2 lists so compatible that at some point they can blend them into one list, because they'll be written the same way, style-wise. And so they can bring them together in one list and eventually have one agency and one electronic system for applying for licenses and one enforcement agency. The administration is taking as much as it can without new legislation being passed. But it's not going to be able to do that with the current Congress. There's no appetite, there's no political support. They can't make enough consensus to reform the laws. So the administration has to take the laws as written. And this is as much as they can do.
Any other questions before we move on? Okay, we're going to talk about how the various rules and regulations that Nelson talked about specifically impact on companies and individuals. And I guess you're going to go first on this.
Sure. I think it's really important that this group is a meeting of CIE and the Society of Chinese American Aerospace Engineers because you work in private industry. And so we wanted to show you cases, all of these cases that you see involving these companies have had cases affecting ethnic Chinese engineers and scientists who work for these companies. I didn't just pick these logos out of the air. There is a publication from the Department of Justice that lists all of their prosecutions over the last 4 or 5 years. And I just went through and I pulled out all the ones that affected Chinese. And so I couldn't even make all the logos fit on one page. I mean, it's a sad joke when I say that. There are so many of these cases. On average, I am seeing roughly 2 new cases every month in the United States involving a prosecution of ethnic Chinese scientists or engineers. So this is a phenomenon that is very troubling. My colleagues in the enforcement agencies say most of their activity for these kinds of violations are coming from 2 countries, China and Iran, both of which are cut off to some extent from access to American technology. And they say roughly 3/4 of their cases are tied to China and 1/4 are tied to Iran. So that this tells you something about, that they're even able to speak with me as a Chinese American lawyer. They're telling me that their caseload is almost 3/4 aimed at Chinese working inside companies in America, or tied to leakages of technology to China. Sometimes they don't have to involve necessarily Chinese Americans to leak to China. But it is to tell you that this is a very widespread phenomenon. And look across the industry. Valspar is a paint company. You know, Cargill is a seed company, an agriculture company. Pittsburgh Corning, what we're going to talk about one of the cases, is home insulation, fiberglass. You know, so we're not talking just about military kinds of technology. We're talking about technology written very broadly across a lot of industries. Ford, you know. So cars, Sanofi is a pharmaceutical company. So we're talking about just an incredible suite of these cases across almost every aspect of American technology. So this first case, and we have all of these in your handout materials, was a case that occurred in 2013 in Pittsburgh. It involved two Chinese who tried to take celluloid foam insulation technology from Pittsburgh Corning to set up a competing company in China. They were caught in a sting operation. This is very common. The FBI or other law enforcement agencies put kind of lines in the water with fake people who are trying to buy technology. And they let people know that they have, or sell technology, and they let people think that there's available technology to go. And these two gentlemen bought into that. Pittsburgh Corning said that the technology at risk was worth over $7 million. Mr. Wong has been sentenced to 18 months in prison and fined $250,000. Mr. Chi, I think, cooperated with the government. He got a much lighter sentence of only $20,000. Before I came to this program today, I downloaded an article from the Pittsburgh newspaper. From a newspaper in the Midwest that covered the hearing where Mr. Wong was going to be sentenced. And he argued through his lawyer at the sentencing hearing that he should not be sent to prison for a very long time because he wasn't taking the Pittsburgh Corning technology to set up a company that would compete directly with Pittsburgh Corning. He only wanted to steal it to compete in some other market. So I'm not sure he had the best defense counsel for saying that he didn't really want to steal it for this reason, he wanted to steal it for some other reason. You know, I think the problem was stealing. You know, and so what we're trying to get across here is that in something as innocent seeming as folks, you know, fiberglass insulation for building walls, you know, can still make you vulnerable to this kind of economic espionage prosecution. And people go to prison for a long time and pay very difficult fines as a result of this kind of exposure.
So, this case is, I mean, what Nelson just talked about is clearly individuals who are caught doing something illegal. But what if you didn't do anything illegal? You can still get in trouble. And that's the cases that I have taken a personal interest in and following. This is a very recent case also in 2013. And Dr. John Bo was a PhD, and he was a contractor for NASA. And this is in Virginia, and the congressman from Virginia, his name is Frank Wolf, very well-known anti-China, China-bashing members of Congress. And he was absolutely convinced that John Bo was a bad guy because he was Chinese and he was stealing national security secrets from NASA. He told NASA that this is so. NASA checked into it, came back and reported to Frank Wolf. John Bo could not have been stealing any secrets because he wasn't working in the area that would involve national security information. He was working in NASA. There's lots of work where you are doing non-national security related work. But because Frank Wolf has funding oversight over NASA, NASA did all they could to please him. But they still didn't please him because they didn't nail John Bo. But what NASA did was the next best thing. They did not renew his contract. by not renewing his contract, he had no more work to do. He had no green card, he had no reason to stay. He bought a ticket, one-way ticket to go back to Beijing. The FBI came and took him physically off the plane as the plane was ready to take off. And they asked him, what computer media are you carrying on you? And Jumbo says, well, I have a cell phone, I have a UPS stick, and I have a memory stick, and I have this, I have that. So that's exactly what he had in his carry-on. But the FBI also checked his baggage, the suitcase, and he had an older computer there, and he had some other things. And so FBI said, you're lying, threw him in jail. So he was in jail for 7 weeks. During this period, he locked out in one way. And this is one of the nice things about the American justice system. He couldn't afford an attorney, so the court appointed a public defender for him. And this public defender happened to be a Cuban American who used to be a federal prosecutor, Mike Nelson, except now he's on the other side. He's a public defender, and he looked into this case, and he was appalled. The government had no case. And so, but he didn't know the prosecuting attorney, so he talked to the prosecuting attorney and said, hey, you don't have a case. The prosecutor searched through all the magnetic media that Jumbo had in his possession, and sure enough, there was zero incriminating evidence, nothing relating to national security. But how do you justify 7 weeks in jail? Well, you justify by saying, we'll let him go, but he has to plead guilty to a misdemeanor charge. He apparently downloaded some pornographic material into his computer. So in exchange for 7 weeks in jail, he pled guilty, and then he was allowed to go home. That's American justice at a certain level for you. That's why I say you can never fight City Hall.
I think because of this criminal conviction, if he ever applies for a visa again to come to the United States, it's likely he'll be turned down.
He will never be able to come back. In fact, he had lined up a job in Europe, so he was just going to go home. In fact, his home is in Chengdu. After he rests up, he was going to go on to Europe to go to work.
So what we're trying to get across to you is that even if you're innocent, if you're in the wrong circumstances, last night I was using the analogy that at dinner with your group leadership, you have 3 dots on a piece of paper. The investigators can look at those 3 dots and connect them and see a line. They could be 3 isolated facts. But if you're inclined to see a line, you will draw the line and connect the dots and reach a certain conclusion. And so what we're trying to get across is we as Chinese Americans are more susceptible when we put up innocent dots to having those dots interpreted as a line in the eyes of law enforcement personnel here. And so Congressman Wolf and the FBI agents who took him off the plane, all of those people were inclined to see a line.
Predisposed to assume that he's guilty and thus proven innocent.
And so, not only is this is an extremely humiliating outcome. It didn't cost him any money. It cost him 7 weeks of his life. It ruined his career, in terms of being able to work here in the United States. Obviously, I don't think any of us would want to be accused publicly of having to plead guilty that we were viewing pornography, through a government laptop. It's really a bad outcome. So we're trying to, sensitize you to some of the exposures here.
Maybe this is a segue. Let me just say that there is another reason for having this workshop, is that if we are successful in avoiding these entrapment and avoiding getting into trouble, then maybe we will begin to build a relationship with the law enforcement agencies, and that maybe we can turn that around and say, hey, we are increasingly relying on Chinese American professionals in this country to keep our economy going. Maybe we need to trust them more and build up more confidence. And that would be the the desirable endpoint but it's gonna take a while, it's gonna take work, and this is why we're doing this.
So this case came up in 2012. It came down in Orange County, California. It involved a company called L3. Many of you in this room may know about L3. It's a major defense contractor. This unit of L3 produced thermal imaging cameras. Thermal imaging cameras can be sold to China, but they require a Commerce Department license. In the record of this case, the company had told Mr. Liang that you can't send these cameras to China without government permission. You have to get a license. That was in the record. He's shipped 7 shipments over 31 months. I mean, this wasn't like a one-time thing. You know, having been told he can't make these shipments, he went ahead and shipped 63 of these systems to China. You know, so he's spending almost 4 years in prison for this crime.
Just among us in this room, I will admit that the Chinese mentality, there is that element of taking shortcuts and going around, right? There's a famous saying, 上有政策，下有对策, right? Where does that come from? There is always this mentality that we can get away with it. Well, these are cases where they clearly didn't get away with it. So and given the complexity of what we're dealing with, you really don't want to take the risk of getting away with something. The next case is yours, still,
Yeah.
right?
This one, I think, is even harder to explain, and we would like to believe, in some sense, that everybody is innocent, but sometimes the misconduct is so palpable and so awful that it's hard, you know, even if I made a jury out of all of you, you would probably convict this individual. This gentleman was dealing with radiation-hardened integrated circuits. These are things that are used in aerospace systems, satellites, and missiles. So the government was able to show that he received, by wire transfer from China, almost $500,000 to buy these circuits. He certified in writing to the company that made them that they were for only U.S. use. And then he promptly took 112 of them to China in his hand-carry baggage after he certified in writing to the company these would not leave the United States. And then to ship the rest of them to China, he packed them in containers of infant formula, all right, to hide them. And then he delivered the whole case of containers to a Chinese ship in a harbor parked in the United States. So this is, you know, last time I looked, he hadn't been sentenced yet. But when we say that there's conduct that makes the government officials very concerned, it's conduct like this. You know, this is not accidental. This is not close to the lie. You know, this man was told these things are controlled. He signed in writing that they would not leave the United States. And then he goes ahead and ships them. This is really dramatically bad conduct. And it really reinforces the impression that there are people who are unscrupulous and are unwilling to abide by American law working in American industry.
So given that we know that there is this pre-existing condition that exists among the law enforcement, specifically like the FBI, here's an example where a totally innocent person ran afoul of that. Dr. Su Haiping, he got his PhD in the U.S. He became a U.S. citizen, and his expertise was in the use of satellite imaging data for analysis related to agriculture, related to the detection of forest fire or the risk of forest fire. And he was working for UC Santa Cruz as a subcontractor to NASA. This is in Mountain View, and the work went on very well, and he was given a badge so that he can then, for the convenience of the work, actually go into the facility at Moffett Field in Mountain View. And when he started to show up for work in Mountain View, the person in charge of security looked at him and decided that he was a bad guy. And he called the FBI, and FBI gave him a lie detector test, never explained why he was given the lie detector test, and concluded that he didn't pass the lie detector test, at which point NASA took his badge away and said, and asked the contractor, UC Santa Cruz, to terminate his employment. The person in charge of security also then went around and told all his colleagues and coworkers that Su Haiping is considered not reliable and considered a security risk, and that he is being terminated. Well, I was personally involved in this case because he called Brian's son to complain about his treatment. Brian asked me to go talk to him. I talked to him, found out the situation, and by coincidence, that same week, I was at another meeting where one of the lawyers from a fairly reputable but fairly small-sized firm in San Jose was giving a talk about employment practices. So I told him about the Su Haiping case, and he was indignant. He said, have Dr. Su come contact me. So Dr. Su contacted him. He took on his case, sued the United States government with a whole bunch of charges, including wrongful termination, this, that, and so on. Well, the presiding judge, after 3 years, I think, of going on, the presiding judge threw out all the charges except one. And the one charge that's still stuck so far is the invasion of Dr. Su's privacy. What does that mean? It means that the NASA guy in charge of security, and I've forgotten his name, should not go around telling everybody the information that involves Su Haiping. You know, the fact that there was a threat of wrongful termination, wrong accusation, none of that stuck in this case, even though he clearly was wrong. Now, the fortunate part about this case is his contractor was very happy and satisfied with the work that he was doing, and they refused to terminate him despite the fact that NASA asked them to terminate. They said, he didn't do anything wrong, we're not going to terminate him. He's going to be able to continue to do his work at home so that he doesn't have to go to the Moffett Field. All right. Now, if, in this case, the judge is still reviewing before making a decision, Nelson doesn't think that Dr. Su will win. But if Dr. Su does win, it will be unprecedented, because for the first time, he took on City Hall, and he won. We'll see.
This is your data physics.
Oh, okay. Here's another case. All right, Bill Chen was from China, and he works for a company that was selling shaker tables. And shaker tables are, I think, I'm sure you know, it's a accelerated fatigue test. You put components and things on a shaker table, and you measure how long before the part breaks down. And he claimed that he sold these to a certain locomotive factory, and the BIS folks came to say, no, we think that you sold to a particular missile building factory in China. Well, he had turned in the proper paperwork, and Data Physics, his employer, was ready to defend him to the bitter end, until the government called and said to Data Physics, if you expect to sell any more shaker tables to our agencies or our laboratories in this country, you're going to have to cut him loose. So they cut him loose. He was in a state of limbo for, I think, 9 months, at the end of which all the charges were dropped against him, no charges, except that he was out of the job. So in this case, he actually quoted to the San Jose Mercury News. He basically said, hey, I have no future here. I might as well go home. So he took his family and went back to China. Now, these are just samples of cases. And Nelson, I know, has a lot more cases where the principals involved were guilty of the charges. I also know a lot of other cases where they went through hell for no